This is Philanthropy Unfiltered, a podcast series featuring interviews with philanthropists and leaders in the social sector. I'm Kat Rosquetta, founding executive director of the Center for High Impact Philanthropy. In this episode, our host, Jake Leaf, speaks to Dan Pallotta, an author, speaker, and nonprofit leader whose views on nonprofit spending have spurred much controversy and debate. Dan is the founder of Advertising for Humanity and serves on the board of directors for the Charity Defense Council. His TED Talk, The Way We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong, has over 3.5 million views and continues to spark dialogue in the sector. Today, Dan tells listeners why he continues to hold his controversial views, how he responds to the critics, and what misconceptions he believes are preventing the nonprofit sector from achieving greater impact. Let's join their conversation.
I'm sitting here with Dan Pallotta today. Dan has been a disruptive voice in the nonprofit sector for over 30 years. In 2013, his TED Talk, The Way We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong, went viral, being seen by over 3.5 million people. He's published numerous books on philanthropy. And Dan, thanks so much for joining us today. It's really great to have you.
Nice to be here.
So Dan, in the 1990s, you started a company called Pallotta Teamworks. You had these multi-day fundraising walks, and they were a huge success. Save on breast cancer, the Out of the Darkness suicide, and I read that by 2002, you'd already raised over $500 million for nonprofits. Harvard Business School had done case studies on you, and then it sort of all ended overnight. What happened?
Well, we achieved enormous results, as you said. We raised more money more quickly for AIDS and breast cancer than any events in history. And we were under constant pressure from the media and others focused on our overhead instead of the amount that we were raising, focusing only on overhead. Oh, your events have a 40% overhead. Yeah, well, they're expensive. We're taking people on a 7-day bike ride from San Francisco to Los Angeles. We're taking 4,000 people. We need to feed them. We need to shower them. We need to provide them with medical support. We need to recruit them. So turns out if you want to do an event that's going to net $7 or $8 million, that's the kind of expense ratio you can expect. So long story short, our partner on the breast cancer 3 days, the Avon Cosmetics company, and their breast cancer foundation, basically appropriated the breast cancer 3-day concept and decided that they were going to go try and do it on their own in 2003. And in 2002, we netted for them $70.9 million net after all expenses. And when they went to try it on their own, that figure drops down to $10 million, and their overhead actually went up. So, as I said in my TED Talk, this is what happens when we confuse morality with frugality.
Talk a little more about what happened there with the overhead. What were people concerned about when they were looking at Pallotta Teamworks?
Well, see, people look at overhead in general in charity, right, and they don't ask anything about what results are being produced. So let's look at that in terms of fundraising, and let's look at that in terms of social impact. So people will look at the bake sale that has 5% overhead and compare it favorably to the professional fundraising enterprise with 40% overhead, and they'll say, look, at the bake sale is morally and economically superior at 5% overhead. Look at how lean and how efficient they are, and everyone will agree. And no one will ask, well, how much money did the bake sale raise? Well, the bake sale raised $70. The professional fundraising enterprise netted $70 million. But those figures never get looked at. We just focus myopically on the overhead figure, and when you make that kind of a comparison, between $70 and $70 million, you see how utterly irrational and foolish it is. Then on the impact side of things, people will look at the soup kitchen that has 10% overhead and say, that soup kitchen is so much better than this other soup kitchen that has 30% overhead, and they ask nothing about what good is being done. Then you go visit the soup kitchens and you find that the 10% overhead soup kitchen is serving rancid soup to about 70 people a week, whereas the 30% overhead soup kitchen, because of their investment in overhead, is serving 5,000 people a week hearty, nutritious soup. Why? Because overhead allows you to better administer your programs, better manage them, better develop them, and overhead allows you to grow. It allows you to raise more money. And if you can't raise more money, you can't grow. If you can't grow, you can't possibly address the social problem at scale. So if we want a bunch of kids with lemonade stands that have, 0% overhead, then we should expect no impact because they're going to raise $12 and not be able to do anything.
So why this obsession with overhead? Where did this come from? And why is it still driving today the philanthropy sector?
Well, it started in the 70s, people looking for simple ways to measure charities. We're a culture addicted to simplicity. So we have latched on to this simplistic measure. It's very cheap and very easy to calculate. You take the amount of money that the organization raised and you subtract out the amount of money that they spent on quote unquote the cause, and there for at the press of a few buttons you have an overhead ratio. And now you can create rating systems based on the overhead ratio, which is what Charity Navigator did and what Charity Watch did. And so you're feeding the public's appetite for this very, very simplistic measure. Meanwhile, you have no idea what good is actually being done because the overhead ratio doesn't measure it, doesn't attempt to measure it. It would be as if you went into a shoe store and said, bring me the shoes with the lowest overhead. I don't need to see the shoes. I don't even want to try them on. I just want to know that I got the shoes with the lowest overhead. That's how we evaluate charity, on the basis of price alone.
You wrote about these issues for over a decade, but it wasn't really until the TED Talk that this sort of went mainstream. So since the TED Talk, have you heard people come back to you with stories of how their funders have changed, how they're thinking differently? I mean, what are some of these stories, the feedback you've gotten from the TED Talk?
Yeah, the TED Talk was amazing. That's an incredible platform. And I'll tell you the biggest thing that happened about 8 weeks after the TED Talk really took off, and people like Nick Kristof and Arianna Huffington and Melinda Gates and others were retweeting it. 3 of the major evaluators, Charity Navigator, the Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance, and GuideStar, issued a joint press release to the American public they called the overhead myth, in which they told the general public essentially that many charities should spend more on overhead. Asking about overhead is a poor measure of a charity's performance. So that was like hell freezing over for Charity Navigator, which had built its entire business on measuring overhead, to say overhead is a poor measure of a charity's performance. So that was, one big thing that followed the TED Talk. And then I have lots of stories of, someone saw the TED Talk and a donor saw the TED Talk and they decided to hire a new major gift, to fund a new major gift officer so that we could raise more money, so that we could grow. See, that's the thing that we need to teach the general public is, you've been taught that spending on fundraising is wasteful. Actually, spending on fundraising is the biggest lever you have. If you put $1 into fundraising, that could turn into $3, $4, $7 for breast cancer research or for aid to the homeless. If you just wanted to go to programs, it's only going to be $1 for programs or $1 for breast cancer. So when you invest in fundraising, you multiply your contribution. And think about it this way. Do you want to be the only donor? Because when you discourage your favorite charity from spending on fundraising, you're saying you don't want them to find other donors. Now, is that really what you mean? Do you really want to bear all the burden yourself? Do you really want them to have to keep coming back to you over and over and over again because they can't spend money to find other people who can contribute as well?
There was a line in your TED Talk that really stuck with me. It was the one where you said, you want to make $50 million selling video games to kids, we'll put you on the cover of Wire magazine. But you want to make $500,000 trying to cure kids of malaria, and you're considered a parasite. Can you speak to this a bit?
Yeah, well, we've got this Puritan mindset about paying people in charity. We think that people should do it out of the goodness of their hearts. What we don't realize is that has a very powerful side effect, which is it gives the best and the brightest in the world a mutually exclusive choice between going into the for-profit sector and doing great for themselves, or going into the nonprofit sector and not doing so great for themselves, but doing good for the world. And there are some saints out there, some brilliant people who are saints who will do this work for nothing and who are very talented. but there is an inadequate supply of them. I'll give you an example. Senator Chuck Grassley called for an investigation of the Boys and Girls Clubs when they found out the CEO was making over $800,000. And he called for the investigation because he said it's unconscionable. This money is supposed to be going to kids, and the Boys and Girls Clubs gets government funding. What they didn't point out is that CEO had tripled network-wide revenues from $500 million to $1.5 billion and doubled the number of kids served. Meanwhile, the head of Lockheed Martin makes $31 million a year. Lockheed Martin gets 95% of its money from government contracts, and no one is calling for an investigation of that CEO's salary. So imagine if the Boys and Girls Clubs had hired a lesser person at a more palatable salary of, say, $200,000, but that person wasn't capable of increasing revenue. So you would have saved $600,000 on the salary and lost $1 billion a year in new revenue that the better CEO was able to raise. I mean, that's the very definition of short-sighted, and that's how we do things in the charitable sector. You know, we invest money in finding the best pitcher for the Boston Red Sox and the best coach because we want them to win, although that's not true this season, right? But don't we want to find the best people for our charities who can win, you know, who can beat the social problem? So if we want to solve these problems, we better start investing in the talent that can grow these businesses to the scale they need to be and that can have the kind of impact we want to have.
And a side effect to this mindset, and something you've mentioned, is, you know, our young generation coming out of university having to choose between doing well and providing for themselves or doing good for the world. So you're a father. Would you encourage your own children to pursue a career in the nonprofit sector when you're so aware of the struggles and the complexities?
You know, here's the thing. People say to me, well, look, there's enormous good feeling and psychic benefit associated with helping other people. And that's what draws people into the sector. That's what gives the nonprofit sector a competitive advantage. It's that psychic benefit. Well, look, there's a hell of a lot of psychic benefit with making, $1 million a year and being able to write a $100,000 check to charity, number one. And also, if you work in the for-profit sector. And number two, you're then saying there's no psychic benefit in the for-profit sector. So for my kids or any kid, there are plenty of places they can go and satisfy that tremendous desire to make a difference in the world and get stock options as well, leaving the nonprofit sector with very little in the way of competitive advantage for attracting these people. We've got to change that, or we're never going to change the world.
So how do we move the conversation from overhead to impact and get philanthropists asking those right questions?
Well, we have to change the way the public thinks about charity. And how do you change the way a culture thinks about something? Well, you focus on that, and the nonprofit sector has not done that. You get methodical about it. You make that your goal. So we've created this entity called the Charity Defense Council, and it's going to fill a number of voids in terms of changing public mindset. So first, we'll act as an ad agency for the sector, and we'll start doing advertising all over the country to begin to provoke people to think differently about charity. Secondly, we'll do anti-defamation work so that when CNN attacks the Boys and Girls Club, there will be a voice there, a national, powerful voice, in the same way the gay and lesbian community has GLAAD to offer the public an alternative point of view. And we'll do legal defense work, and we'll actually organize the sector to stand up for itself. Those four things are things that have not happened before. The sector has remained largely silent. It has cowered in the face of sanctimonious, moralistic people pointing a finger at them for spending too much money. And it's time for the sector to take a lesson from the gay and lesbian community and stand up for itself and come out about its true dreams and come out about what it really knows is required to achieve those dreams. And it ain't low overhead, and it ain't low salaries.
6 months ago, I think it was probably your first campaign with the Charity Defense Council, seeing those billboards. What has been, promoting some key messages around these issues? What were some of those messages, and was the response pretty good?
Yeah, that particular campaign, it was 8 high-profile digital billboards that simply said, don't ask if a charity has low overhead, ask if it has big impact. And it's the first time the public had ever seen a message like that, because everything anybody has ever told them before was ask about overhead. That campaign generated a front page story, top of the front page feature story in the Boston Globe. So, it doesn't take a lot to get the conversation started. What it takes is us refusing to do nothing anymore.
So overhead is obviously, we've just been speaking a lot about it, something or your billboard campaign was about. What are some of the other unwritten rules of fundraising of the nonprofit sector that you think are sort of damaging to the sector?
Well, I'd say there's 5 of them. One is you can't spend money to lure talent away from the for-profit sector because that's immoral. So we've talked about that. The second is you can't advertise on anywhere near the scale the for-profit sector does to build interest in your organization and revenue coming to your organization the way Coca-Cola does and Apple does and every other for-profit company does, because that's wasteful. Third, you can't take the kinds of risks that the for-profit sector takes in terms of trying to find new revenue. If you ever did that in the charitable sector, if you invested $200 million in some fundraising idea and it went belly up, we would expect people to be indicted. The fourth area is time, so we give Amazon, still Amazon's 20 years into its business, still regularly posting quarterly losses, and the stock keeps going to new all-time highs. Imagine a nonprofit endeavor that says for 5 years no money's going to go to the needy because it's all going to be invested in generating this scale. We would never tolerate it. And the fifth thing is the lack of a stock market for charity. The donation is the only financial instrument for charity. So there is no venture capital market for new fundraising ideas. So the for-profit sector monopolizes the multi-trillion-dollar capital markets for all of its Uber and Facebook and Twitter and all of the new ideas it wants to try out. The nonprofit sector has zero in the way of risk capital or growth capital. So you put those 5 things together, and you've just put the sector, with the best of intentions, with this frugality mindset, you've put it at the most extreme disadvantage to the rest of the economy and left it largely unable to create large-scale social change.
So what does 10 years from now, what is our sector going to look like?
NYU did this study, and they found that 70% of respondents believe that charities waste either a great deal or a fair amount of money. So what I want it to look like 10 years from now is 70% of respondents believe the opposite, that we've liberated the sector to invest much more in its growth, to compete in the media and advertising with the giant consumer brands for consumers' hearts and minds and money, and we've moved charitable giving from 2% of GDP to 3% of GDP, which would be incredibly substantial, and that money has gone disproportionately to health and human services organizations. And I also think we need large-scale consolidation in the sector. There are simply too many nonprofits. 97 new nonprofits form every day, all kinds of duplication of fixed costs, all kinds of duplication of effort. And the reason we don't have more merger and acquisition activity in the sector, which is what we need, is simple. We've stripped all financial incentive from the sector. We've said self-interest in money is bad when it comes to helping other people. So we pay people, with holy points in the sector, and holy points don't drive merger and acquisition activity. Money does. So we need to figure out what financial incentives we can create. Maybe it's very significant tax credits, like 5 years' worth of your salary in tax credits if you're on the executive team of a charity that agrees to merge with another charity. Something substantial in the way of financial incentives. So growth and consolidation and a focus on impact, I think that's how we're going to create real social change.
So for the new philanthropists, to distill it down, what is your message to them?
It would be twofold. Invest in structural change in the sector, like that's where it's really at. Invest in changing the public mindset, because the public has a lot more wherewithal to increase the pie than you do as an individual philanthropist. Like if you would work, say, with the Charity Defense Council on moving charitable giving from 2% of GDP to 3% of GDP, that's something you could never hope to do with your own money in your lifetime. And secondly, I would say, to the extent you're married to a particular organization, start investing in their fundraising and in carefully vetted plans and teams with great track records that can reach the goals of those fundraising plans.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day and really appreciate all this insight and advice.
Absolutely, Jacob. Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to Philanthropy Unfiltered, a podcast series featuring interviews with philanthropists and leaders in the social sector. This podcast is a collaboration between the Ubuntu Education Fund and the Center for High Impact Philanthropy at the University of Pennsylvania. For more on this series, visit impact.upenn.edu. Thanks for listening.